Hey everybody, it's Dom from Lensprotogo and Lens Rentals, and welcome back to the channel. So, a couple of weeks ago, I did a video on the Leica Q2, a Leica point-and-shoot with a fixed 28mm Summicron lens on it, and I absolutely loved it, but I don't think that it quite satisfied my expensive German camera craving. So this week, I bargained for the full Leica experience, shooting on the Leica SL2 and a couple of M-mount lenses, including the coveted Noctilux 50mm f/0.95. So full disclosure, that was a $12,000+ photo lens, and the SL2 isn't cheap either at $6,000, making this camera lens combo with the adapter and the media worth just over $20,000. Now that may seem a little insane, and I kind of agree, but I'm not going to get into the justification of the pricing of these things in this video. What I am going to do though is review this camera. So let's do this thing. So first, I'm going to brush through the physical features of this camera, and then I'm going to briefly talk about the internal stuff, and then we're going to have a chat about the SL2's compatibility with M-mount lenses, and then finally we're going to see some test images. So the Leica SL2 is the second generation of the Leica SL, obviously. And although I've never shot with the original, I kind of gather that the changes made to the body of this camera were generally well accepted. Now, how do you know that this is a Leica camera? Well, they've told you right here with humongous lettering right on the prism, in addition to the red dot logo right next to it. So one of the first things that stood out to me was how slim this camera was. Considering it's a larger camera, I was expecting the body to be a little thicker, but it's not. And I think that really aids in handling the camera and countering the weight of heavier lenses. The grip on the SL2 is very deep, but proportional to the size of the body, and I think it gives the camera a really great, robust feel. Now, this is a Leica camera we're talking about, so that means we should expect everything on the SL2 to be milled to perfection, and that was pretty much the case. Every button and dial on it feels super robust and has an excellent response. With that being said, however, the camera still maintains a really minimal layout, which is consistent with the Leica look. There's a nice large label-less top dial, a display screen, and of course the shutter button, which has a ton of real estate. There's also two custom function buttons right underneath here, and also two more right by the lens mount. So one thing I absolutely loved about the SL2 is this rubber joystick. This is excellent for selecting your AF area, but more simply, it's just so articulate and has a great rubbery response. The SL2 features the new L mount, the mount developed between allianced manufacturers Leica, Panasonic, and Sigma. It has 10 contact pins above the sensor, and like a true Leica mount, only needs a few degrees of rotation to lock the lens into place. The viewfinder in this camera was very clear and bright, and has one of the best diopters I've ever used. The screen on the SL2 is also excellent. It's very bright, accurate to color, and is touchscreen capable. And just like everything else on the SL2, I can tell that it's very well housed into the camera. The SL2 takes two SD cards, and we'll talk about media in a moment, and those are accessed by this nice wide media door that spans the whole side of the camera. So the SL2 takes the same battery as the Leica Q2, and in my Leica Q2 video, I mentioned the unique battery ejection system, where you have to release the battery using the lever, then push the battery in to unlock it. The battery life on the SL2 wasn't phenomenal. I wouldn't even say it's good. If I was going out for a full day of shooting with this camera, I would want to bring like 4 batteries, and I didn't even take any video when I used it. Okay, last thing about the build of this camera, the sensor. The SL2 has a full frame 47.3 megapixel sensor, but it's slightly modified to add a layer of micro lenses above the sensor to make it more compatible with M-mount lenses. So moving on to the internal stuff with the SL2, I'm gonna start with the biggest thing, and this is 5-axis image stabilization. Now, this isn't confirmed, but it's kind of probable that the 5-axis stabilization in the SL2 was probably borrowed from a full-frame Panasonic camera like the S1H. There aren't any options to fine-tune the stabilization, but I guess I didn't really need to because my image through the viewfinder while I was using this camera was pretty much rock solid the entire time. And if I steadied my hands enough with the stabilization on, I could probably take a still photo at like 1/20 shutter speed and still get a sharp image. So as I mentioned before, the Leica SL2 takes 2 UHS Type 2 SD cards and has a couple of options for writing data onto those cards. So I should mention that this camera camera absolutely requires the fastest SD cards that you can get your hands on if you're planning on shooting raw DNG files. And this reminds me of my one major complaint that I have with the SL2. Shooting continuously in RAW choked up the camera way more than it should have. I was using Sony Tough SD cards, which are some of the fastest cards available right now, and the camera's buffer was still getting really choked up. And this prevented me from shooting at times, and I honestly missed a couple of shots because of this. So if these are the traits of the new Maestro 3 processor that Leica put into this camera, then I'm honestly not that impressed. Okay, moving on from that, it can also shoot 20 frames per second and has a maximum ISO value of 50,000. It's also got 255 AF areas to choose from and includes Leica's object detection autofocus system, which I did not experiment with much this weekend because I was shooting on manual lenses, but I hear the autofocus is pretty much on par with its competitors. I didn't take a single frame of video on the SL2, but it can record 5K video and 4K video in 10-bit, all internally of course, because there are absolutely zero inputs or outputs on this thing. So quick thing about these M-mount lenses. Supposedly in the past there have been issues when adapting M-mount lenses to non-native bodies. And as I mentioned before, Leica took a step in the development of the SL2 to include an array of micro lenses over the sensor to make them more compatible with the optics of M-mount glass. This weekend I had the 21mm super-elmar and the 50mm Noctilux, both incredible but totally different lenses, and accordingly I put them to the test in different ways. So let's check out some of the images I got using the Leica SL2 and these M-mount lenses. Okay, first I tested out the 21mm by shooting some free-range chickens down the street. So because the lens was so wide, my best bet was getting nice and close to these chickens, which did end up getting me in trouble at one point, but after we talked it out, I was allowed to come right up to the fence, and the chickens were starting to come around to the idea too. The bulk of my experience shooting with the SL2 was during this portrait session in the city. For this whole session, I used the Noctilux 50mm opened all the way up to 0.95. So hint hint, manually focusing at f.95 isn't the easiest thing ever. And even with such a great viewfinder, I was still double guessing where my plane of focus was. But for the shots that I did nail focus on, I was super pleased with how the focus falls off. It's hard to justify a lens this expensive, but if I were to, this would be one of the reasons. Shooting so wide open, you can still achieve a great sharp image in a low light scenario without cranking ISO or dropping shutter speed too low. So in conclusion, the still image quality from the Leica SL2 is basically amazing. These raw DNG images from this camera are no joke. At an average size of like 85 megabytes, you know there's some serious data packed in there, and that absolutely shows in the editing program. It has excellent dynamic range, huge resolution, near perfect color rendition, even if you totally mess up the white balance, and high ISO images don't look too bad either. As for highlight and shadow recovery, the SL2 trends way more towards shadow recovery. So the name of the game during the portrait shoot, for example, was generally exposed for the highlights. So in camera, it looked like I was losing a ton of my shadow area, but I knew that that was going to be easily recoverable, unlike the highlights. The image from the SL2 is also very rich in color depth. In Lightroom, I was very easily able to manipulate specific color ranges while leaving skin tones completely unaffected, which could allow you to do a cool selective color edit like this that was all the rage in the 2000s. Okay, that's gonna wrap it up for this video on my experience with the Leica SL2 and a couple of Leica M lenses. So if you have any questions about the SL2 or either of the M-mount lenses that I used with it in this video, you can always drop a comment in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, if you liked this video, make sure you hit that like button. And if you're not already, subscribe to the channel so you can stay tuned in for more of our weekly content. And we'll see you in the next one.